So this would be like a good Tony Buzan. We've kind of changed the environment a little bit. And then we'll perhaps take somebody and just kind of have a look at what the value of a lot of this stuff is. Now, you're going to get from me a rather simplified version, because that's how my mind works, of what we should be looking at here. I don't do major biomechanical analyses here. I kind of just sort of see, I'm a bit like Greg Grieve with the ribs, who says perhaps all you have to do is move them about a little bit. I've got a slightly bit, I would feel somewhat guilty about saying move them about a little bit. I would like to say I can perhaps distract them at the costotransverse joint or traction them at the costovertebral joint, but when it comes down to it, perhaps all I'm doing is moving them about a little bit, okay? But in this area, what we've sort of seen is that stiffness is a kind of key feature of the dysfunction here, with some hypermobility, possibly in a segment or two higher than this area in the cervical spine. And that if we're going to protect this, we need to move this. Now, we know that when we come to looking at the cervicothoracic junction, say it's here, or here we've got the vertebra like this, that we can view this by a whole variety of ways, okay, which you've been doing. We can look at the effect of side flexion on the cervical spine and see whether we get rotation in query which direction, or whether we get it at all, which sort of signifies that this will not move into side flexion rotation. The trouble is that with all of these like specific level tests, if we go back and look at generalized stiffness, do they tell us very much to start with? Or in the ways that Grieve talks, perhaps we should be loosening this up a little bit. And then put our biomechanical analysis a bit later in the treatment regime, when we've kind of got things working somewhat. But if it's all stuck like this, is there very much point? I'm just asking you. I mean, I don't think there is. I'll come out with my thing of going into whether the arm comes up here and it side flexes to the same side. Because if somebody's stuck like this and the pectorals are tight, this so complicates what you find at the back, or stops it, that you're struggling to think, geez, is this moving? Well, actually, it's a tight pectoralis major in front, perhaps. And so in all of these sort of individual tests, I still go back not so much to a biomechanical analysis of the shoulder girdle. I think that's good to put in later. And a biomechanical analysis of what happens when we move the arm. I think we've got to look at this a little more globally and start doing things to change all of the things that we find. And is it possible to say that, you know, that scalene is a primary thing, or that first rib is up and that's the primary thing, and all we've got to get it down and then everything else kind of moves around and corrects itself? I think just this gets very stiff and dysfunctional. And with the sympathetic nervous system, it has kind of more global effects, as Ottendorp talked about with dizziness, but how all of us talk about, you know, down to T4, the T3-4 syndrome with paresthesia in the arms and all this kind of stuff. And perhaps the individual analysis is something to leave a little bit later on, and that's how I do it. Now, what's your feelings in your own synthesis? Are you kind of doing a sort of very accurate biomechanical? That's fine if you feel that that's where you should go. I think sometimes you waste a lot of time with this, though, instead of just getting in there and moving them about somewhat. And this absolute specificity around here of looking at what happens is not so good. But I do think that there is some value in looking at the effect of the cervical spine on this area, certainly. Because if I do this and I get pain in the cervicothoracic junction, Is it because I've activated something below C4, C5, C6, like this, and sent referral pain down into the posterior primary ramus? Because you remember with Cloward's work, when he did the early anterior fusions of the spine, he found that with down to C7, and this sort of tends to refute some of the morphology, I must say, in terms of evolution, of the arms pulling out and the skin from this area going to the arms, so you've got a whole section in the cervical spine, that, or lower part of the cervical spine, where there's not continuous dermatomes. All right? But he found that you would get pain down as far as the lower part of the scapula with disc problems at C8. And so that we could get C6, C7, C8 causing posterior scapular pain. The thing that it usually doesn't cause is anterior rib pain. So if you get this and this, I think you're dealing with the cervical spine, the cervicothoracic junction. If you get it in the back by itself, I don't think you can guarantee that, and I think we have to do a few tests. Now, the one test that I have for this is sort of a real simple thing. Can I just get you out here a second? And then we can kind of talk about all these tests, because it's kind of nice. You've just done a thoracic course, so I'm kind of picking your brains on what Diane's teaching now, because I might have to review all my ideas again. Because I look at her as being one of our leading people, a really, really bright person. I was saying to Dad a little while back, you know, Dad, you drive me crazy. Here you are, you're running a clinic, and you've got 2 kids, and you run your 2 kids, and you write books, and all I seem to be able to do is get through my day. Amazing, amazing. It drives me crazy when I look at you. Plus the fact you're developing all these new ideas. How do you do it? Well, I seem to have enough time. Can you take your top off, Debbie? Yeah, right. Well, if it is, I want some. I bought that book on smart drugs. All those special sort of things that are still possible. We can't get them in Canada, but you might be able to get them here at the health food stores. Okay, so if I were coming back into that sort of position there, and that caused pain into this area, I don't know whether it's the extension of the neck, or is it the extension as it arrives into this area that's causing the problem. So I have a kind of real simple little test. I simply say to Bob, can you just slump a little bit there? And is that okay? Yes, it is. Now I want you to keep that slump and just take your head back a little bit like that, so that we keep the thoracic spine in flexion. We don't allow it to go. Then I can say to Bob, how does that feel? No, she said, that still causes the problem. So I would be looking round about 6 or 7 for this. On the other hand, if she said, no, I can get right the way back there and it's not causing a problem, and then I say to her, now, one by one, I want you to include these vertebrae. Oh, that's the pain. And I would then sort of start looking a little bit more in detail at that particular segment as I go back.
How do you get her to recruit one by one down?
Just by putting my fingers on, putting my hand on the front and saying, bring this in. And I'm trying to sort of go back a little bit into an extended position. So if we come here, we've got this forward there. And then I say, and I can hold this now, bring this one in, bring this one in, bring this one in, like that, okay? So I can support the neck now and make sure that this is not being stressed further and further back, and then I can get to Barb to just bring this in, next one in, like that. And I think that's quite useful. If this movement causes the problem, like this, then what I would do would be the same test but slightly in reverse. I'd take the head into a slightly neutral position where there's no pain, and then I would ask her, by supporting the head like this to stop it going into more flexion, I would kind of ask her, can you take this forward? There. Can you take the next one forward? There. Can you take the next one forward? So we don't allow the neck to keep stressing the dorsiflexion here. And, you know, this is kind of very much up our alley to do this, because we know we can use this as mobilization, and so we can do these movements. And the flexion and extension is important. As far as if Barb, none of those hurt, but when she went into side flexion like this, it caused a problem. Okay? Is it because the side flexion has produced down into the upper thoracic, caused a difficulty there? Well, I could perhaps do a couple of things here, and we could sort of talk about this. I could ask her to keep the head still, drop the shoulder down on that side, which has now produced a right side flexion here, and then I could ask her still to do the left side flexion in the neck. So this is kind of locking up. Or I could use a non-congruent lock if I wanted to. I don't usually make it as complicated as this. I simply sort of try and put this into an opposite position there, and then come down here and see if it causes the problem. Or I would use rotation. We know that side bend and rotation go together throughout the whole of this segment, but that side bend is very much restricted in the thoracic spine by the existence of the ribs. So if that causes the problem, okay, I would then go into just doing a side bend movement down like this, and then I would ask her to rotate, and I would try and compare the difference between the side bend movement and the rotation movement here. And as I say, I can eliminate the other movement by putting this either in rotation or in side bend opposite. And I think this is a matter of just sort of experimenting a little bit and seeing if it's valuable. Now then, as far as all of the other things are concerned, I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a movement like this. I'm going to take hold of the pectorals and have a little look at this. I'm not trying to do any major analysis here. I'm just saying, geez, we've got 5 things we better get on with for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll do a more complicated analysis. I'll look at the first rib position here like this. If it's up on one side, is it being held up by the scalenes? Slight side tilt of the head, not too much, because I don't want to produce a rotation in the upper thoracic spine which creates a change in the first rib. So I take that down just a little bit and have a look if it's changed. If it hasn't changed, it probably needs to be mobilized. If it has changed, the scalenes need to be stretched. You know, when you're doing 45 a day, you haven't got time for fiddling around. You've got to sort of hit the right thing. And it's got its downside too. But you just, you know, some of these people just need to get working on, rather than a whole sort of set of analysis. As far as doing intervertebral joint motions, come and lay on your side there, Bob, with your head up this end. I would absolutely suggest that you have the arm over the end of the table for this, because if you don't, the first, second, third, and fourth ribs are all being held stuck by the bed, and they hold the vertebra stuck. So we just let this come around here, and I would make sure we don't have any rotation. I'm using all my principles of trying to make sure that my body and her body are totally in concert here, and then I can move back here and have a look at the extension movement with a little bit of a posterior